Good afternoon. On behalf of Reuters, I want to thank you for coming to the Multigenerational Workforce. I'm Josh London, Chief Marketing Officer of Reuters, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Joann Jenkins, the CEO of AARP. Joann, as CEO, leads the world's largest nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization, addressing the needs and interests of people 50 and over. Since joining AARP in 2010 and heading it since 2014, Joann has transformed the organization into a leader in social change, dedicated to empowering people to choose how they live as they age, more important than ever. Without further ado, here is Joann Jenkins. Thank you.
Good morning and welcome, everyone. We're excited to join with Reuters to co-sponsor this important discussion today on the future of work, and it comes at a very significant time. This year, people aged 60 and older will outnumber children aged 5 and under for the first time in history. Demographers predict that for countries that are aging well, more than half of the children born today will live to be age of at least 100. And some researchers predict that the first person who will ever live to be 150 is alive today and in this room. No. Just wanted to make sure you were listening. We believe that global aging is the greatest opportunity of our lifetime. It has the power to transform markets and spark new ideas across every sector of the economy. In fact, we view the growing older population as a key driver of economic growth, innovation, and new value creation. According to AARP's recently released Longevity Economy Outlook, in the U.S. alone, people 50 and older contribute $8.3 trillion to the economy each year, and this is predicted to triple to $28.2 trillion by 2050. If this were a country, it would be the third largest economy in the world behind the U.S. and China. The economic activity of people 50 plus supports 88.6 million jobs in the U.S., and these numbers are only going to grow as millennials move into their 50s beginning in the next 10 years. This longevity economy outlook is a wake-up call to businesses, to entrepreneurs, policymakers, and other leaders to rethink the attitudes towards people who are 50 and older. As people live longer, they're also wanting to keep earning longer, and as a result, we're soon to have 4 to 5 generations in the workforce as in an emerging reality. And as more businesses seek to develop strategies for marketing their products and services to an older market, they're also beginning to recognize the value of a multi-generational workforce. In a recent survey of over 1,700 global companies, we found that 86% identify a multi-generational workforce as a valuable attribute to their organization's success and growth. And they're looking for tools to help them build it, as well as solutions for breaking down barriers that prevent those who want to work longer from doing so. A multi-generational workforce benefits the global economy as well. And according to OECD calculations, giving older workers the best opportunities to work would raise the GDP per person across OECD nations by 19% over the next 30 years. One thing we know for sure, as our population ages, as technological innovations continue to change the way we live and work and relate to one another, and as our societies and workplaces become more global and more diverse, work in the future is going to be very different than it is today. This raises a lot of significant questions. How can global multi-generational organizations create agile workforces to meet the challenges of this new economy? How would this change our office cultures, and what does that mean for an organization? How can organizations address the opportunities and the challenges presented by technology, especially in a 5-generation workforce? And what role does ageism and age bias play in adapting to the 5-generation workforce? And what can organizations do to overcome these? At AARP, we're working with international institutions, including WEF and OECD and the UN, to identify these best practices and economic incentives for building and supporting and sustaining a multi-generational workforce in the age of increased diversity. In 2010, we joined with WEF and OECD to establish a learning collaborative called Living, Learning, and Earning Longer to identify and share workforce practices. Through regional discussions, research, and conversations with executives and companies around the world, we're identifying the standards, the policies, and the practices that reflect an age, diverse, and inclusive workforce. We're going to release the findings and conclusions here at Davos next year in a digital learning platform that will help all interested executives and companies build their organization's capacity and get the most out of a multi-generational workforce. So our discussion today will help inform this effort. We want to learn from you. So now let me turn it over to Lauren Young, our special projects editor at Reuters, who will begin our discussion.
I am Lauren Young, and I identify as Generation X. Thank you so much for coming. I want to introduce our panel. You can identify your generation. You don't have to, because no age bias here. Larenia Yee from McKinsey. Taso Du Val, who is from Toptal. I have, it's okay if I'm touching you. I hope that's all right.
That's okay.
Because all these people are really good in HR stuff. So Tayu from Cisco. And finally, Othman Laraki from Genomics in San Francisco. So we got, well, actually, we're the only New Yorkers, and these are all West Coast people. That's interesting. Okay. Curious, and I'll let anyone answer this, does age matter?
Yes, in a good way.
Why?
Because what it does is it gives you a richness of point of view, and it also reflects society at large, which are your customers, and they span all of that. We're no different from it, and the best that we can serve our customers and society is to be able to mirror what's happening out there, so we think it's an asset.
Talk to me a little bit about Colors. It's a really unique company, but you really span every generation, correct?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I mean, we, from a generational standpoint, and also from a gender diversity standpoint, but I think one of the things that, in some ways, that we were fortunate that was kind of just part of our core when we started was we had a team that was pretty diverse, both from a kind of age standpoint as well as from a kind of gender mix perspective, and that's turned out to be kind of like a very big asset for us, and it's also one of those things that self-perpetuates, once you kind of have the seed. Where it's easier to recruit people when they don't feel like they're the only outlier, and so that's one thing we found is kind of like just obviously it's much easier to kind of like start that way, and as opposed to needing to kind of change the structure of a company afterwards.
Talk to me a little bit about age.
Well, I think, it's a self-fulfilling question. Of course, age matters, whether you're super young or super old or kind of in between like me. But I think more importantly is what are the skills that accompany you on that journey? And a couple of them that are going to be particularly important are around adaptability and curiosity. And I plucked those out, and there's many, many other skills. But alongside of the statistics that you were saying in terms of how we think about it, and it does scare me that I could be one of the lotto winners to be 150 years old. Oh my gosh, that's a lot more work left. But if I just take that back a little bit to think about the next decade ahead of us, when we think about 2030, one of the things we will experience, all of us, no matter which generation we are, is a massive change in terms of the nature of work. And we know that automation, in particular, will disrupt something between for every 1 in 5 jobs, will be significantly reshaped. And we know that that affects men and women equally, but those are different jobs. And so as you think about that journey, whether you are in your young 70s or you are in your young 20s, you actually are going to be going through an experience together of having to learn new skills and having to find professions and job codes that didn't exist before, and finding that even really traditional jobs like being a nurse or a teacher are fundamentally reshaped, that you maybe only recognize about 30% of it. So to me, I think age matters, but it's alongside of the tectonic plate of what we're about to experience at work over the next decade.
Tell me how it matters for your company, because you're in a little bit unique position because the people are very experienced.
So some background, Toptal is the largest fully distributed company in the world. We're the largest fully distributed workforce of high-skilled labor.
Will you define
Globally?
fully distributed, because that's a
No
jargony.
office. Everybody works from home. So about 5,000 folks, and everyone working from home. And so
Look at how excited they are.
I wasn't expecting that reaction.
Like
to be honest.
5,050 now.
Could they be working right here in Davos
We have
right
a lot
now?
of jobs open. We'll go apply. And so we are the largest fully distributed workforce in the world, growing extremely fast. Now, the interesting thing, and I was actually looking at this data today for this specific panel, is that 84% of our network, and also similar statistics for our core team, which is about 700 folks, are millennials. Now, anyone can apply for these jobs, but what's interesting is that for the opportunity, age does not matter, but for the dynamic, it does for the individuals. And so we have to adapt to those individuals' needs. We also have to convince folks, apparently not folks in this room, that working from home is valuable and can happen fluidly today. So it certainly doesn't matter for the opportunity, which I think is often the heart of the issue, but it does matter for trying to craft a culture where, furthermore than a culture, a working environment where folks are keen on what tools they're using and how they're interacting and collaborating. Because not every generation is as attuned or comfortable with working remotely and interacting in those types
Which
of ways.
segues perfectly to my next question. Anyone's welcome to take it. What are the challenges of managing a multi-generational workforce? What do you think are the big ones?
One thing from I think we've seen is just sometimes very different life stages, right? Like, new grads, they're happy to work, to be in the office, very long hours, et cetera. Once people become parents, priorities start shifting. Obviously, that's a big impact on women in terms of, especially like just post-birth, like the first like pregnancy to 2 years. The amount of just like disposable time does change, and so having a work format that accommodates that in a flexible way, I think, and to the kind of the remote pieces, it's I think turning out to be one of the biggest ways to get some flex there, where you can have people that do maintain productivity or are still able to still be kind of involved without showing up in person, and that ends up being, I think, a really big enabler.
I think that Gen Z is a bit of a wild card on this one. And the reason I say that is when the perception is that each of these generations have attitudes that are very, very different. Although when we look at attitudinal data, at least in the United States, with respect to diversity and work experiences, actually you don't see as much divergence between Gen Y and millennials and even boomers, even though there's a hashtag #OKBoomer, which I haven't.
We're not allowed to use that today, just so you know. That was banned.
So that one, put that
The
aside.
hashtag is World at Work and Reuters Davos, FYI. Keep tweeting.
But we don't see as much divergence in attitudes, even things about like family and work. But when we look at people who are 30 and under, we actually start to see the markers of a very different set of perspectives on work. And just like a very concrete example is that men and women in the United States under 30 are 2x more likely, 2 times more likely to think that diversity is a must-have and core piece of what they expect to experience at work versus kind of an optional appetizer. So when I grew up and started working, it was nice to have diversity programs. It would be nice to see more women at the table, but it wasn't actually what you expected to see as table stakes in terms of an organization that you would be willing to be a part of. So there's a difference there. And so as we start to see the divergence, and even if you look at the household structure, you're increasingly seeing dual careers as opposed to single careers. And so as the younger generation, I think, navigates work and has different expectations around data, transparency, even things like diversity, I do wonder how that will come together in a multi-generational setting.
And you were about to talk, but you were one of the early employees at Cisco.
Yeah.
What do you have employee number?
It's in the low 3 digits. So.
Wow. So you've really seen it all.
Well, so if you look at the composition of our workforce, it's 50% millennial, about 41% Gen X, and about 9.5% baby boomers. And then we have a little bit in what they call traditionalists. The oldest age is 84, and then we have a little bit in Gen Z. and the youngest would be 18 years old. And what we find, though, is that, and I agree with you, they're not just segmented by generation, because there's a couple of themes that run through that. One is flexibility, because no matter at what age you are, there's grandparents' leave. There's spousal leave. There's so many things that people are doing, but what is common is fair and being well. So financial health, physical health, mental health. That's a common theme, and the fairness piece keeps coming along. Diversity is a must. It's not even diversity; it's just the way the world is, and they expect to see that, and it ties into the fairness. And then the other thing that we look at, because we believe in full spectrum, and the reason is that you may be a millennial today, and Kirk's standing back there, and we have lots of interesting interchanges, but you can be a millennial today, but you're going to be in the same age bracket as Gen X, within a few years. And so it has to be a constantly solid base by which you enable people to come and want to come and work for you and stay working for you and bring their best, because it means that much to them.
We talked so much about flexibility. What is the draw, and why do you think it's a multi-generational issue?
Well,
What's the term that you use?
in terms of,
How you describe people who work from home?
well,
Fully
Fully
distributed.
distributed.
fully distributed.
I just think
remote
it sounds
worker.
like a marketing thing. I gotta get that one.
Remote worker, let's call it.
Remote workers. Okay.
Somebody who works from
that I understand.
And so I guess I'll take a step back and say flexibility on all of the studies. McKinsey did one. We've done ours. Many other HCM companies have done their own. It's always number one or number two, as we've seen it. And so it's a
Do you
big,
hear that, bosses in the room?
It's a-
People like flexibility.
it's a big draw. And so we're able to attract talent and get really the best folks because that's in place for us. And so having that platform, having that base to be able to have people come in and know that we value flexibility, and actually the whole company is effectively predicated around flexibility, is a very big draw, and it's also a retention tool. So I would just say as a blanket statement that flexibility is key, and an organization has to ensure that it is conducive to flexibility. Otherwise, you'll lose talent to other companies like us who are flexible.
But I think also related to that is kind of the advent of the gig economy, which is if you think about working with a flexible framework, with the technology that enables you to do that, kind of a work culture environment, it also can mean that you can participate really differently. And I wonder also how that's going to affect people who are just at different life stages. Right now, I'm fine working 100%, but I might actually want to engage, 50%, but still be an integral part of a company. And so I do think as kind of traditional norms have been reset, that actually just provides a lot of opportunity. But it also must feel really scary to people. It's like being overwhelmed with too many things on the menu at a restaurant. Like there are just so many ways to engage in work and so many reskilling opportunities. Which ones matter, and how do you prioritize and navigate your career into your early 70s?
I actually think, though, that flexibility also is a really important inclusion piece. I have a man who works for me, and I have not physically seen him for a decade. He has a degenerative disease, I think. I don't know exactly what it is, but it's hard for him to come to the office, and yet he is so present, so on there. He's the first person who responds to issues. But it enables him, 20 years ago, he would have had to go on long-term disability, and now he's participating. So the flexibility is there, and also think about the fact that we're individuals who are part of an ecosystem, a family. And so you see people moving back home for a period of time when they have to take care of aging parents, and grandparents helping out their children. And so having that flexibility doesn't tie you to a place. What matters is the outcomes, the impacts that we have on our customers, on our teams, and the values that we espouse as part of our corporate culture. And if we can keep that solid, it's just a real asset to be able to have a flexible environment.
For more experienced workers, I feel.
You mean like my age? Is that what you...
I didn't say that. But we're not using older. We're saying more experienced, veteran. Veteran is good. For people who have more experience in the workforce, I feel like companies really bend over backwards to attract millennials. Maybe you agree or disagree, I don't know. But when it comes to older workers, I don't feel that there's as much out there.
I don't agree with that.
Oh, good. Tell me why.
Well, it goes back to flexibility. I mean, one of the first things we did was put in the types of leave that you need. I mean, if you're a grandparent, you want to be able to take care of, spend time with your grandchildren, help your kids out nowadays. Well, kids come back and live with you, and stuff like that is going on as well because of the cost of living. And, flexibility was one, but it's also the services that they provide, financial services, mental health services. So I don't feel that it's focused that way. I think that there are moments in time when it's almost like going after a new market. We all have customers, and you go after it and you have special programs. It doesn't mean that the core of the company goes away. It just happens to be a program that we're focused on. So I don't think that it discriminates or leaves behind, the more experienced worker. And the more experienced worker actually has a real asset because you can be a mentor and a guide, the carrier of culture. You have the relationships with the customers and you can smooth things out. There's just a lot of assets, and not just because I'm in that experienced area, but yeah.
What do you think, Othman?
Yeah, one thought is kind of like just a bit of a tangentially kind of related, but I think has an impact in terms of the flexibility points earlier too, which is one thing we've noticed. I'll give a concrete example that we've seen is one of the things that we do is because we do population genomics programs for large populations, very distributed patient groups like Teamsters, like big unionized workforces, et cetera, to provide healthcare services. So, for example, genetic counseling is something that has been very scarce as a resource within kind of like this kind of new model of healthcare. And one of the things that we did, and it's kind of like we weren't deliberately thinking about it. It's almost sometimes better be lucky than smart. We went through a job that tended to be very scarce and kind of said, let's build some software tools to refactor, like decompose what this existing job looks like, and see which parts can be done in software just by people on their phones, and what is the kind of kernel of what is this real kind of irreplaceable part of this job. And it's literally you, an experienced person in genetics, talking with a person when they're getting an important healthcare result. And we realized that actually you could completely virtualize that service and turn it into almost a utility. Instead of having like genetic counselors in clinic, it's very scarce capacity that every hospital will have like 2-3 genetic counselors, and that's a complete overutilized resource, et cetera, and stops them from scaling. You turn that into utility, and then you can create a very distributed workforce. And now, for example, we're doing work with the NIH to serve 1 million people across the US, and it's all based on this virtualized workforce. And it's actually enabled both on the kind of on the age spectrum, but also at very different life stages. For example, a lot of women who, for example, were genetic counselors in clinic at a certain point of their life, like with young kids, et cetera, they decide they don't want to be full-time, long commuting, et cetera, and they were getting out of the workforce, whereas now they can say, what, I'm going to take my 5 hours a day, or like after hours, et cetera, and it actually dramatically increased capacity of this workforce that used to look scarce, but opened these jobs up to people that would have otherwise, not been participating at all. And I wonder if that's also a pattern. Maybe it's kind of like a derivative of the gig economy mindset, but I think that's actually going to be a very big democratizer of access to work, I think, over the next few years.
I think part of it's also the premium on expertise, which is what you were both saying, which is that expertise is so important, especially as we think about more of a knowledge economy. And I think this is a little bit more in the context of Western European countries and the US, so it may not completely apply in all cases. But if the premium is on expertise and on knowledge work, then it's related to where do you find that. And when technology can basically pull you into an organization from anywhere, it means that if you actually open the frame of how do I source talent, and I'm, can be partially or fully distributed, then you can actually provide lots of things. I think there's a little bit of the matching game is a little tough, which is how do you let people who have great experience and maybe are in their 50s realize that they can come back, and how do you provide a bit of the on-ramps back in? But I think it's pretty exciting. And there's also something about the younger generation who's just getting in here, how do they develop the expertise? And I think that's also what you were saying about mentorship.
So from your comment about it being a derivative of the gig economy and yours about subject matter expertise mattering, we've characterized that as the talent economy. And that's something that we really talk
I like
about
that,
a
the
lot
talent economy.
all over the world, with publications, with journalists talking about how the talent economy is sort of the antonym, I suppose, to the gig economy, whereas the gig economy is short-term work, generally speaking, low-skilled labor, ephemeral, no career progress. The talent economy has career progress, long-term work, high-skilled labor. So it's almost a perfect parallel, and that's how we've really captured that.
I think, Tay, you mentioned this earlier, I think about diversity. There is language that we've been using around gender diversity, which I think is going to apply really well in a multi-generational workforce. So examples, we've done so much on unconscious bias. I mean, I think almost everyone will say, oh, yes, I have been in an unconscious bias workshop.
Raise your hand if you've
Raise
been
your
in
hand if you've been in an unconscious bias
Bias
workshop.
training.
And probably that was applied towards gender norms. But if you think about what you were learning there, that also speaks to understanding how bias affects people's sense of inclusion and belonging in a workforce that may be virtual or in person, and how you would bring in different people with different backgrounds. And it's not always going to be gender. It could be that they're of a different age, of a different background, of a different nationality. So, the seeds are there for a much more dynamic workplace.
Yeah, we call that conscious culture.
I love that.
Yeah, I agree.
So we have the talent
Economy?
conscious culture. We have so many new things to talk about. When it gets to younger workers, we know that social impact and mission are super, super important. We had a conversation because we did a little prep call before, and I made the point that is it the millennials who are driving the bus on this? And you don't necessarily think so.
I think that every generation cared very deeply about what's happening in society. And you talk about the greatest generation, I mean, in terms of sacrifice and, social engagement and service to community. The difference is that it was the times, right, where you separated work from, Milton Friedman and, all of that. You separated work from your personal. And I'm telling a story that, please don't tweet this out, but somebody who I used to work with said that they had a corporate PAC, political action committee, and she felt that she had to give to that PAC, and then she would come home and give twice as much to the ACLU to undo what she did at work. That was I was really struck by that. That was a sign of the times, and I was just devastated. I said, how can you go to work when your values don't match? But that has changed, and I think what's happened is that the true you comes out in an environment where you've always cared. All generations care about their, if nothing else, just their communities, whether it's just their religious communities, but there is something bigger than self that every generation cares about. Now you just have permission, not only permission to do it, but you actually can demand it, and that's what we're seeing. And so hats off to
this changes it too, because there's a platform.
That's right.
So I think that's the thing is Gen Z are they're the digital natives, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they will the only generation that doesn't know what it's like to live, whereas I remember. Anybody else want to chime in about millennials and social mission? And are you? What's your social mission?
Well, we
Put
have
you on the spot.
we focus on education primarily, and so we have an initiative internally called Toptal. Actually, have two. One is Top Volunteer, which allows all of our talent to basically contribute their time to working on projects remotely, which is a surprisingly difficult issue to solve because nonprofits are very reluctant to just have random people work on their projects, even if they're very skilled. It's actually a fascinating issue unto itself. But we also have Toptal scholarships, which we give out scholarships every single year, about 5 to women who can contribute to code, to open source projects, and the best contributions get scholarships.
Cool.
And so that's our focus, and we highlight that, and people care about that, right? They are jazzed that a company like us are embarking on this.
I think people really care what company. This is what you do for a living, but I mean, how is it important for companies to get that message out, what their social impact is?
I mean, I think the discussion here in Davos has been really interesting because there's a a piece around, call it 21st century company, or a change in sense of purpose and mission of companies. It's been in the air,
all
in the
along the
waters,
promenade.
It's all around the promenade. But I think if you take that beyond kind of the headline further down, I do think that companies are rethinking how do you draw the lines around your mission? How do you draw the lines around who are your stakeholders? Is it a single-threaded shareholder value optimization, or is there a broader set of responsibilities, especially with challenges like sustainability? It's hard for the private sector not to be a participant and a leader in that and just kind of stand by.
And that cuts across all ages.
It cuts across all. And I guess what I would say is I do think that Gen Z's perspectives and attitudes are a bit divergent in a good way. And I think if Gen Z and the younger digital natives are putting pressure on organizations to think through those values, those responsibilities, redefining where business sets those boundaries, that's a good thing. And one of the things that I find really interesting is what you see is the obligation to engage. We may disagree, we may end up at the very same place we were, but the premium on engaging in that authentically is a huge piece of it. And so even if you find that at the end of that journey, you decide that shareholder and profitability is the overarching mission and focus of your company, engaging with your workforce on that is fantastic.
I want to talk a little bit about, I hate the term, but there's nothing else to say, work-life balance. And at different stages of life, what that looks like and how companies can help people.
I have a point of view on that.
I knew she did.
I don't really. Balance is an interesting word, and I think all of us struggle with balance of any kind. But I think it's really more work-life integration. In a real practical sense, is how do you? The work is the work. It has to get done. You have a customer who needs something. What are you going to say? Well, I have work-life balance, so sorry, I can't go, right? And we're not going to do that. But when you have work-life integration, you figure out within your family what works for you. So if you need to go to take care of certain things, you go do it. If you have parents that you're taking care of, you go do it. But you fit it all in. What we're measured by at the end of the day is outcomes, right? Did we provide and do what we said we did? Did we hit our targets? And that can't go away, because if having targets are really important. I think probably to your point, when you have a fully distributed workforce, the only way you can measure it is outcomes, right?
Absolutely.
And so if we focus on the outcomes, for me, it's more of a work-life integration.
Great. You allow pets in your office. I mean, others might, but that just makes me so happy. What does that bring to the workforce?
Pets specifically, or more of a flexible?
Just the vibe.
I think one thing that's kind of I think an interesting challenge, and I don't think we have the right answer for it, but I think the reality is work is hard, and stuff needs to get done, and there is a kind of as a team and et cetera, you want to have a way to, there is a premium to how the people that are going to get it done, and part of that is a volume game. Hard things oftentimes do require a lot of work, and the question is, how do you square that with allowing people's ambitions and their goals? For some people, they're you want to be able to nurture the most intense and high kind of output people, but also not make it a kind of a sweatshop or kind of a culture that just rewards kind of just long hours,
drudgery,
et cetera. And so I think the points around kind of trying to create being deliberate about a currency that's really outcomes oriented, where it's we have a set of things that we kind of in our interviews, we kind of questions that we ask within the team and one of them is GSD, which is this a person that just gets shit done? And it is sometimes things that are just thvery simple, right? And that throughput per unit of time almost is something that we value a lot. And then that I think that at least creates a little bit of that flex that's really kind of creating that currency around just people get things over the finish line. And people have a lot more time that are kind of et cetera are going to get more volume done, and that's okay, that's great, that should be recognized. But really kind of trying to put that currency on kind of just that the intensity as opposed to volume. I think that's at least been, sorry, that was very different than the pet question. But yes, we do also love dogs.
And they have a chart, a flow chart that introduces all the animals in the office, which
Yeah.
I really want a copy of. I'm going to go visit.
They get badges.
I want to allow
Very
you
nice.
to ask some questions. So if you raise your hand, we have a mic, and if you don't mind, we have a question right here in the front. I happen to know this person, but she can still introduce herself and ask the question.
Thank you. So Anna Luzardi, I'm actually an academic studying some of this issue. Can I ask you about the price of this? I am old enough that we used to have contracts, where you have to, I don't want to say 40 hours, but is much more than 40 hours in the office and so on. So like if people have this flexibility, how does this translate it into the wages that, these people can get and so on? Is there a trade-off because they are getting this more flexibility, and how is this changing the labor market?
Anybody want to take that?
I don't think I mean, the salary is a salary, and you figure out how to get the work done. So I'm not sure that, I'd have to look into it, but I'm not sure that
For contract work, does it look different?
It doesn't actually. We haven't.
Time and full-time pay the same thing?
I'm sorry. Say again.
Full-time pay, part-time. Is there such a thing as a part-time Toptal worker?
There is,
Okay.
but it's quite strict. It's 20 hours a week, and so they're not going to go past that. Full time actually means emulating a full time environment.
100
And
hours a
so,
week. That's what that means.
Sometimes that's a very normal week. Sometimes that can be very intense, and those vicissitudes, those fluctuations, that's just par for the course in life, and so and work, right? So, it's not as straightforward as it's 40 hours or it's 100 hours. It's meet the demands of the week.
Yeah, one thing to chime in on that, like I think one quid pro quo in some is this implicitly happens that I think people really respond to is having a lot of flexibility the other way. Exceptional times happen in a company's life where everyone mobilizes to get something to happen, but that also happens on the family side, and having a lot. I think one thing at least we feel is like creates a lot of loyalty is when people have something happen and the company's like, we're not counting, parent is sick, a child is whatever, take a month off, it's okay, like it's not vacation
Unpaid or
time.
paid?
Paid.
Fully paid.
Paid,
Like
okay.
that's
That's
something
that's the
we
big
have a policy
difference.
where we just don't, like, when people have things that happen in life, there's no accounting for it.
So you as a manager, if you're a really good leader, you understand the value and the contribution of your employees. So I had an employee whose father passed away, and the mother was just falling apart. She was afraid she was going to die. We gave her 6 weeks off, fully paid, because, and she comes back and makes up for it. So it's, but to your earlier question, there are very specific regulated things. So when you do contracts or they're hourly workers, it's very clear what, and there's legal frameworks around that. If you're at what we call exempt in the US, which is you're a full-time employee, you have a lot more flexibility in terms of, and at the end of the day, people generally give more than they take. That's what you find, because it's whatever the work demands.
We have a question over here.
Thank you for a great discussion. My name is Greg Hagan, partner and managing director with CCS. We're a strategy consulting and fundraising management firm for nonprofits. Building on the theme of work-life balance, but more so integration or alignment or fit, it's clear we're all thinking about our families, our careers, our communities, and ourselves in terms of leadership and management. Would you have any specific advice in terms of moving a corporate culture from balance to fit, harmony, or integration, and increasing output in terms of volume and intensity as was described?
You answer that. You're a McKinsey person who's.
They're very high. Look, I think that culture change, I think it starts in a really grassroots way. So, I think the traditional feeling is let's top down, change something, and put sort of a big thing. But what I find in terms of what sticks really well is to actually let the culture create the culture it wants to become. And so it's a lot of grassroots thing. It can be the dogs and the pets, but that's not the only thing. It's part of more the expression of the workers saying, this is the community, this is the culture we want. And how you as leadership reinforce that by saying, it feels like we informally have been giving a lot of people paid bereavement. It actually would make sense to formalize that as a bereavement policy so that it's not something we're doing on a one-off cases, but that is actually something that really means something to our workforce. It seems to us that our, parental leave is just insufficient for it, and we absolutely know that when people come back rested and ready to work, they're going to contribute a lot more. So let's actually change our parental policy to 20 weeks. Did the government tell us to do this? Absolutely no. The U.S. government's definitely not going to be telling us to do that. But this is what fits for us. And so to me, I think a lot of it is that more grassroots change, because that's also super authentic and it sticks and it matters to the people who are there.
The people who take the really hard stuff, and when companies stand behind them, are they more likely to stay?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So, a lot of the tech companies have a recharge, which is that, the typical way it works is every 5 years that you've been at a company, you take 5 weeks off paid. Everybody does.
That's not us, though.
I know you guys don't do that.
We do that,
A
actually.
lot of tech companies do that. And what's fascinating is, whether you get really excited about this policy or something else, what you hear is that first it normalizes flexibility, but secondly, you hear how excited people are when they come back, and how strong employee loyalty is, and how much energy they're going to put into it. So, I think it's interesting to see what sticks in your culture, and what the changing norms are. The other thing is you should ask your competitors what they're doing. Or you should ask your peer companies, what are you doing? Because a lot of those ideas are perfect ideas. Maybe you guys will think about recharge.
Well, we have an onboarding and offboarding, but it's not every 5 years. So.
Yeah.
Other questions? Got one over here.
James Falk from Hong Kong Exchange. Thanks very much for the discussion, which was very hopeful. And I note that that there's been a lot of discussion about how this improves diversity. That's generally good. How it encourages ongoing learning. But I mean, just to be the devil's advocate,
I knew it was coming. I could hear it. Come on, bring it on.
Are there any problems created by multi-generational workforces, and are there environments that they're not suited to?
I see the wheels are turning.
I mean, one thought is like when it's discordant with one's lifestyle, right? Like I think that's where I think having, when it's possible, roles that incorporate more of that flexibility, I think allows you to accommodate more. I guess maybe it's to separating two things. Like one is it desirable as a general thing, like in the same way as diversity from a gender standpoint, et cetera, or ethnic background, et cetera, but then is it practical? And I think on the desirability side, I think most people would say yes. And so the main question is, how do you reduce the transaction cost for it, right? And I think that's where, for example, making some work more flexible, making the chunking up the roles into refactoring them, et cetera, I think makes it more practical, as opposed to needing to take a trade-off, for example, as opposed to saying, okay, we're gonna be content with 50% less productivity in this job area just to be more diverse, because I think then basically it's just a form of seeing just more of a social contribution as opposed to just the rational thing to do.
But there are bosses that flexibility doesn't work for them. They want the FaceTime. I mean, we're all nodding. So I know that exists.
But we have technology to do that.
It doesn't matter. They like people in the office. You're all nodding. So I think that is.
But I think we focused a lot on flexibility, and I mean, your question wasn't flexibility, your question was multi-generational. And I guess I would just pose that if I think about the structure of work and how much it's going to change, I'm having a hard time thinking of an industry that isn't going to be dramatically shifted over the next decade. So I think it becomes table stakes for a company to be very agile. Now, the cost of managing that as a leader is complex. It's really hard. The first time you have far more flexibility and choice, democratize all of that, let that come in, or whether you're introducing 5 generations into a workforce, or whether you're dealing with job shifts, I think that is truly hard to do. But I think it's a skill we're all going to have as leaders, because it's just whether we opt into it or it's put upon us from an industry shift. That's where we are.
How do we get that skill? Where does it come from?
Well, I think there's a lot of leadership, and we haven't talked about it, but I mean, I would imagine that, the leadership that you guys provide is incredibly inspirational, and there is a bit of how do you step up to the change? How do you lead with it? And I think there is, and some of that are pretty fundamental leadership attributes. So I do think it's a really important time for leaders.
One of the things that happened when we first started doing remote working was the fact that you had some managers who would always call a staff meeting at 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon. Always. Because that was okay, because that was their journey, right? To see, are they there? Are they, are they at Disneyland? Or are they, working? But what's happened now is that there's so much visibility into, because not, in terms of who's online. So you're having a question, it's as if they're sitting next to you. You just, I am them, and they get right back to you. And so once they found their feet in terms of the cadence of work, do I miss these people when they're not in the office? Absolutely. And do they miss being in the office when we're having a party? Absolutely. So there's a lot of things that groups do in terms of, free breakfasts and donuts on certain days. And I mean, a donut costs $1, but people come in for that. So don't ask me why, but they do.
Food is the unifying force.
And when you have, celebration parties and they're remote, they actually feel like they. So there's nothing that can compare to, physical contact, as we just talked about. But in the whole scheme of things, and trying to get 70,000 people running, the smooth machine to make sure we take care of our customers, there are trade-offs there, but you can make that work. You figure it out. And it's going to change some more with different technologies.
I wonder if also, one way to kind of almost, I'm just trying to think about how to decompose your question a little bit. I think one of the other ways to look at it is is it economically rational as a company that's just trying to, from a productivity or and then is it socially rational or is it a socially something that has a social utility that you want to promote? And in some ways, I think on the latter side, it is something that generally there seems to be kind of general acceptance of, but it is a relatively per company choice in some sense, there's no law around it. There's no. On the other hand, on the economically rational side, it's probably not uniformly true across all roles, across all job types, depending on the type of flexibility that's required. And so it's almost like there probably are a certain set of roles, the talent economy, right? If you're just literally just in supply and demand of talent, and you want the greatest supply you can find, there are people across all demographics, so you want to be able to tap all of them. But then there are probably other roles where you're actually taking an economic hit. The only question is whether you also want to do it for a social utility as well. And so, but in some ways there's no cosmic truth to that, right? Cosmic line where that falls, right? I don't know, just a thought there.
Question back here.
Thank you very much. My name is Ilke Hoekstra. I'm the CEO of Royal Volpac. If you listen to your conversation, it all sounds extremely logical and makes a lot of sense. When you view it from today's point of view and the days that we're living in. And if you look at how sort of our workforce was constructed 20, 30 years ago and the values that you had there in society, it looks really old-fashioned, and we can't even believe that was the way that we organized ourselves. Take yourselves 20, 30 years ahead.
It's a great question.
And if you look at the workforce that we're constructing now, there must be a flip side to it. There must be something that we're missing. There must be something old-fashioned. There must be something in there that we're doing wrong, whether it's too individualistic or whatever it is. Could you give me a sense of what your concern is with your workforce today?
I think we're going to miss the donuts.
Yeah.
So the donuts are a ritual. And what I've been thinking about are the rituals that bring community together. And when you provide all of this flexibility and freedom and kind of paint your own individual map, what happens is that you've optimized the individual. But do you have the collective that brings you together? And so we used to have something where everyone would come to the office on Friday. So people in consulting are traveling or they're spending the whole week with their clients, but Fridays we're in the office. Now, Fridays are less in the office because some people are in the office who are old-fashioned like me, and others are taking advantage of all the flexibility to have the most amazing Friday. But as a result, we're not having that actually together. So that's making me think, what are the new rituals? What are the new types of donuts and home Fridays that we can introduce to feel that the collective is really valuable? And I do think that will be something we'll miss a bit more and more.
So I'll follow up on that and say one thing that, and I've been running this company for about 10 years now, and one of the things that has brought everybody together and has been,
Right, how young are you?
and the most powerful transformation that has happened at the company is us giving really elaborate, almost theatrical, transparent insights into what is happening at the company every single month. And so, we have folks in the room from Toptal who are listening to this, and they'll resonate with that. We know that from feedback. So you could think of it as a all hands or a town hall meeting on steroids, where this is what happened this month. This is the growth that we experienced, the numbers that have changed, the products we released, the people who made that happen, all the different insights and relevant salient points that happened for that month. And every month, everyone is blown away by these. And it sticks people together. It glues them to the company because they feel like they are part of the company. They have the KPIs. They know how the company is moving. They have insights into every aspect of the company. And so it's a very powerful mechanism, and it's quite unique to us. We put a lot of time into them, so it does take a lot of effort to get all the constituents, all the executives to put all the numbers in. Then we have to make them look nice, presentable. It takes about an hour and a half every single month, but it really is something that's quite unique to us. And it's not just a town hall where oh, this is, we're doing this thing. It's really in-depth. It really brings everybody together, and it's very insightful.
Thank you for your reply. I just wanted to respond. Our company's 404 years old, so we've seen a few different types of organizations.
Do you have any 440-year-olds working in it?
Almost someone who's 150. We're almost there. Thanks.
Oh, I just wanted to ask quickly, if it's okay, the future, very briefly, future. What's going to be old-timey?
What's going to be what?
Old-timey.
I'm the contrarian. I actually think sometimes we come back, everything old is new again. It just looks different. So I think that we're going to find, like we do a beat every month, which is a monthly update, and that does bind people together. But I think that, to your point, the donuts, it's going to be using technologies and doing competitions and things like that. You have gamification and things like that. I think that will change. The commons is just going to be virtual commons. But you've got to get together once a year at least, the whole team. I mean,
old-timey for you?
I think one thing that I don't know how
I just like old-timey.
Change, but is that going I don't know how the arc of training relative to exploitation of that training changes due to technology, because we came from an apprenticeship kind of relationship
Learning.
to work where you're an apprentice for the blacksmith, and that you're the blacksmith for your career, your entire life, etc. Right now in our generation, it's basically the 4 to 8 years of college, postgraduate, etc., and then you exploit that for your career, more or less, right? And that seems to be currently changing, where those people are getting their pivots or reinventions of their careers, mid-career, etc. And I do wonder, whether, especially as you extend your shelf life, on a career much longer, and as the definitions of jobs maybe kind of change more dynamically, whether we this notion of a 4-year college and then you're exploiting that for 40 years. By the time 40 years have gone by, the world has changed so much.
Or 440.
Or 440, right? But within one person's career, whether that gets
that traditional
deeply
education.
rechunked, whether this notion of
That's
what you
really
studied in undergrad.
And we're actually looking at non-career, non-college degrees now. We have to look at that, because can educational institutions be more about skills?
Can people afford it?
Well, they can't afford it. You have debt and no job, it's a problem, right? But the notion that I'd like to really challenge universities, because they're going through a crisis as well, is think about, are you an institution of ongoing learning and it's skills transference? The other stuff is okay. You can still get a 4-year degree, and learning to learn, liberal arts is very important and all of that. But for the majority of the workforce, can they get skills and slide into, and can you go from gig to an employee and back to gig again, and it's just kind of recycling
We
yourself.
could stay here all day, but I'm going to take a last question, and then we're going to have a wrap-up.
Thank you. Greta Corporal here, Research Fellow, University of Oxford.
We're not blaming the
I
universities.
work at a company that's over 700 years old.
Okay, 700 years old. Does anybody else in the room work for a company that's older than 700 years old? Raise your hand. Reuters is 160.
So as
Go ahead.
an academic, I always try to put things in perspective. And thanks so much for organizing this panel, by the way. And I'm just thinking on the opposite, like, is there a thing like single generational bias? If you think about how work happened, and you know, I'm originally from the Netherlands, and when you think about the time of the guilds, the pre-industrial age, hasn't work always been multi-generational? And is it like, you know, you clearly had an idea putting this event together, and we're here because we care about these issues. Like, what is it in the model of work we develop together that leads to this single generational bias? Can we acknowledge it's there? What are the factors that contributed to it? That's my question. Thank you.
Great. I have my own theory, but I'm curious if anybody has. What is the factor?
I mean, I think there's all sorts of bias. I'm not sure, just to challenge you, I'm not really sure how relevant that is, because I think you are processing whether that idea had different form factor 600 years ago or you're living it now. The question is, how are you processing the workforce that you have to match both your social moral commitments and your societal commitments with the economic output of what you have? And I think that is the basis of the discussion. Academically, are some of the things we're wrestling with just in, you know, new packages and formats for what existed before? I'm not that worried about it. What I am worried about are leaders actually deeply thinking about how they operationalize things. And I think something that's evergreen, that never goes out of fashion, no matter whether it's remote, technology enabled, or just old school in the office, is values. And I think that the core values of a company become incredibly important as you diversify the modalities. Those values, especially if you have workers coming in and out with more fluidity, which may have happened 200 years ago, but certainly is happening right now, having people anchor on the core values become incredibly important, and making sure that you spend the time to explain and create a deeper understanding of the values and expectations around conduct and behavior, that becomes really important.
Great. I'm going to ask Joan Ruff to come up and give some closing remarks. She's chair of the board of directors of AARP.
I want to thank everyone for being here, and I want to thank the panel for some very enlightened comments. I think one individual over here said very hopeful, and I'm very hopeful after hearing all of you. But I would like to talk a bit about just a couple of little observations that I have, and observations as an experienced worker. All right, but my first observation, I really want to talk about the multi-generational advantage. And again, you've talked a bit about it, but that is the aspect of the value of the older worker. And to recognize that older employees do bring considerable assets, including problem-solving skills, calmness under pressure, a proven capacity for collaboration, institutional knowledge, and a higher level of engagement. And these are those traits that have been pointed out as really critical for organizations to propel their economy and the economy in the future. Also, the successful workplace of the future will be inclusive, and you have talked a lot about that. But it's not accidentally inclusive, and you've talked a bit about that, perhaps coming ground roots. But it does need to be intentionally inclusive. By intentionally inclusive, I mean we need a smart strategy, each organization, that embraces inclusivity across the age span, gender, and all aspects of inclusion. It must be intentional, visible, and meaningful. Meaningful in the sense that older workers and women are not just part of a statistical profile, i.e. we have X people age X and over, or we have X women in the organization, but that they are part of mentors, leaders, and very central to the corporate success. The other thing is when it comes to culture of the organizations, and again, you talked about the culture very much so. We do need to move from what we think of often as a bro culture to what I would call a co-culture. And that is a co-culture as in co-ed, cooperative, and co-creating. And again, you did talk a bit about that. Now, in the area of technology, and one of the things I want to think is that you did not talk much about technology or the question of older workers and technology, although I think in one of your questions over here, what are the aspects of older workers that we sometimes may come in with a bias. But I just want to say that a couple of observations on that. The notion of a technology deficit often used for older workers, which is often illegally used, talked about technical natives or digital natives, and that word did come up, digital natives. But in fact, the technology gap is both overstated and substantially narrowing as cohorts age. It might have been an issue in 2000, but it's increasingly anachronistic in 2020. And I would put that in perspective by saying, I don't know how to build a car, but I know how to operate it. And that's what's important, that everybody knows how to operate technology. And when we look at technology, you don't need to know how to program it. But you need to know what buttons to push, how you can use it, how you interact, as you were saying here. And I think of my grandson, who's 10. And as I talk to him, he's going all over on his iPhone and pushing buttons like crazy. I mean, it's like, and I say, Connor, how do you know what you're doing and why? He says, I just push buttons. And I said, I know why I'm pushing a button, because I know what button pushes and therefore charges my credit card. He has no idea. And while it's very exciting to watch him, I'm a little concerned when he's behind a car. So anyway, again, it's working across generations. Everybody uses technology, and everybody understands the value of technology. But my second point in technology is that even as many role tasks are as handled by robots, the uniquely human skill of experienced workers remains critical to the future of work. While there are limits on robots, one of the big limits is that they are not consumers yet. And I think we all recognize that in technology, we will have more robots, we will have the way we work, but we still need workers to buy goods and services that are produced. Again, we need to think in innovation of projects, of products and services that do cross all levels, and I believe you talked about that. Again, we need to maximize that, and we maximize that by having multi-generational workforces. Those workforces who in fact can say, yes, for me this is what works, or have you thought about how this will or won't work for me because I'm in this generation. So again, we need to always work with our organizations, multi-generational, to really come up with that innovation that's necessary. And finally, I would just say that I am very excited because I know we're all going to work together to really maximize the opportunity for cross-generational organizations. And I, again, as Joann talked about, I want to make sure that you know about and sign on to our Living, Learning, and Earning Longer Collaborative. To do that, this is a collaboration between AARP, OECD, and the World Economic Forum. Please go on to www.aarpinternational.org/LLEL to find out more information, or please stop and talk to a couple of our people here from AARP. We have Jean Akias and Jeffrey Gulo, who will be happy to talk to you more about it.
Get a newsletter from Jeffrey.
Exactly. And yes, that is not the only reason for signing up, but a very prominent one. So with that, I just want to say at AARP, we're certainly looking forward to working with everybody on this critical issue. Thank you so much.
We have donuts, but we still do have some snacks. So please feel free to grab something. And on behalf of Reuters, come again. Have a great Davos.